So I want to tell you a little bit about my history with grammar. I've told you many times that part of the reason this school exists is to atone for my own poor education. So I was not given a lot of exposure to or instruction in the formal rules of grammar growing up. I remember I have a few recollections of being introduced to grammar. One was in 3rd grade, being asked to memorize the helping verbs. And I went home with a friend of mine. I still can picture myself sitting on her bed, taking on this task for homework, and we thought, let's put it to music. And so we settled on the tune, ooh, ee, ooh, ah, ah, you know. And so our helping verb song was be, am, is, are, was, were, been, being, have, has, had. And I don't know if any of you have heard that song, but it is still used in instruction at this school to this day. So that was its origin. I had a brief stint with diagramming in 5th grade, but not enough to really give me any fundamental understanding of grammar. And then in 7th grade, I went to a terrible inner city public school, but I had that one teacher with the tight bun and the kind of pinched expression who scared the pants off of you. And then in retrospect, you recall how much you learned from that teacher. And her name was Princess Flood. That was her actual name. Her first name was Princess, and her last name was Flood.
Wow.
And she taught me, yes, she was a character. And she taught me a few things about grammar. But until I was in my 20s, my knowledge of grammar was largely implicit. It wasn't something that I had conceptualized or formalized in my mind. But I did feel like I had a fairly good command of grammar. In part, I think, because I came from an educated family who spoke with proper grammar and who knew the rules of grammar themselves, so I feel like it was just an influence in my house. My grandfather, the surgeon I've mentioned before, was famous for saying, if you were to say to him, could you please take Jane and I to the mall, he would say, which I? It should be Jane and me. And my father, if you would say something like brang, he would say, today I bring, yesterday I brought, many times I have brought. And that was a refrain in my household. Today I, yesterday I, many times I have. So I've tried that with my youngest, Miss 4-year-old Scarlett, and she said, I bring that to school. And I said, brought. And she said, brang. And I said, no, it's actually brought. I brought that to school. And she said, no, it's actually brang. Kids say brang. And that was the best argument I had heard, so I let it go. So I think between my family and the reading I did and just the fact that I was the type of kid who would absorb things that gave order to the world any place I could find them, I did pick up a pretty good implicit understanding of grammar, and I imagine that's how a lot of you feel too. Out of curiosity, how many of you feel like you have a good command of the explicit rules of grammar?
Mr. Cody.
Yeah. Oh, it's sad. So it wasn't until I actually became a homeschool teacher with my first class of kids and became single-handedly charged with the entirety of their education that I decided maybe I should learn the formal rules of grammar. And I started just looking around for resources, some of which we still use here, like the Warrener's textbooks. And one of the parents brought to me this tattered, stapled, kind of badly made book called Rex Barks that she had picked up at a homeschooling, some sort of homeschooling convention. And I used that book as a resource to teach myself the rules of diagramming, and it is magical. It is such an empowering resource and so wonderful for self-teaching of grammar. So if any of you do decide you want to master the explicit rules of grammar, I can't recommend it highly enough. Mr. Emmy just tackled it all himself, and I think pretty soon he's going to be up here in the rap battle with me and Mr. Cobra. So that took me, it really was an incredibly empowering experience. And I try to reflect, instead of getting into the debates about the value of grammar, which I'm happy to get into in the question period if anybody wants to, but just reflecting on it for myself and the value that I felt like I derived from it. It, first of all, I think the most important value I got from it was that feeling of seeing order in something that was previously chaos. That is an incredibly satisfying, intellectually satisfying feeling, to look at a sentence that is complex and has, it just looks like a bunch of words if you're kind of evaluating it as a whole. At first, it just looks like a bunch of words, but I think for Mr. Emmy and Miss Verkest and Mr. Cobra and me at this point, we can't look at it as a bunch of words anymore. It automatically falls into parts and relationships, and you see within this set of words a structure and a set of relationships that make it much more intelligible as a system. And that has little to do with the utility of grammar, which is, of course, a major part of the value of learning the rules of grammar. But it's a very, very satisfying feeling, and it's one that I think provides a lot of enjoyment for the students. So I always found that kids who like logic puzzles love diagramming, because it's the same sort of satisfaction of seeing patterns and finding order and being able to piece something together. It does, of course, give you the confidence that you know the rules of grammar, whether they are rules that actually resolve ambiguities or whether they are rules that just are more in the category of etiquette. And I think there are both in the realm of grammar. But to have the confidence that if you write an email or you write a job application or you're in a position that you want to have your writing reflect well on yourself, to have the confidence that you know the rules is very empowering. I am told on a regular basis that parents are afraid to write emails to me, or they'll include an apology for their grammar in their emails to me. I'm not really that much of a tyrant about it, so please feel comfortable. But to not ever have that worry is very empowering, and so if we can provide your kids with that, that's very satisfying too. And I think the other thing that was a tremendous value to me and remains a tremendous value to this day is that learning the rules of grammar gives you a conceptual vocabulary for talking about language. It's very difficult to talk about a sentence if you haven't learned how to conceptualize the various parts of it. So let's say, for example, I'm teaching writing or just correcting a writing assignment that the students have done for literature. And I want to point out that their sentence isn't parallel. Parallelism is very important to me. For a sentence to be parallel, that means if you have a series, the parts in that series have to be the same grammatical construction. So I went to the store reading, no one would actually do that, but I can't come up with a bad sentence on the spot, but it needs to start with a verb, or each part has to start with a verbal, or each part has to be a prepositional phrase. It needs to have the same structure. But if I can't tell them if they don't know what a verbal is, or they don't know what a prepositional phrase is, or they don't know, verb tenses, then I don't have the language to discuss with them what their error was or how to correct it. So a huge part of the value is just having a language to talk about language. And I think that's one of the most important things they get here too. So I'm going to let Mr. Cobra and Miss Verkest take over and talk about how they teach grammar in their classrooms. First, I just wanted to mention to you, I don't know how many of you know how Mr. Cobra came to be at VanDamme Academy. So the origin of Mr. Cobra's journey to VanDamme Academy is that he and I got in conversations about grammar over Facebook. He was living in Japan.
Wow.
And through mutual friends, I think we ended up somehow connected on Facebook. We got in lengthy conversations about grammar, and I think one of the early conversations was also about Les Miserables. So it was very quickly clear that he was somebody who belonged here. And as soon as I had an opportunity for a grammar teacher, I made a concerted effort to get him here. And I couldn't be happier that I did. So I'll let Mr. Cobra take over now.
Man, that's a big introduction, but I got to live up to it. I'll let you down. Yeah, she said I was teaching grammar. I was teaching in Japan, and I think the most influential. Actually, I was teaching in Japan, and I was doing my master's degree in Japan on linguistics. And one of the most influential pieces of literature that I'd read on education was The Hierarchy of Education, which was an essay that she wrote. And I could, I suppose, get into, if you have questions about just the process of, just exactly how that influenced me and kind of the process of, how I started to implement that. We could talk about that later. But so I read that article, and it occurred to me that there might be a hierarchy for teaching grammar. Prior to that, it had not occurred to me at all. So one of the more interesting things about me is I have a degree in English literature. I thought that I did very well in college. I was told in high school that I did very well in English classes, and it was terrifying to graduate and eventually realize that I didn't know as much about grammar as I thought I knew. Like I said, I did very well, but I did not have the knowledge that I thought that I had. When I went to teach English in Japan, we actually had an entire interview process where they had us take a grammar test, and I remember taking that I didn't realize there would be a grammar test for that job, and none of us did. There was a group of us in a room getting ready to take that test, and I remember taking that test and realizing I was not going to get that job. We all did. We were all sitting in that office thinking we were not going to get that job. We were all hired. We all got that job. And I went away to Japan to teach English. And I don't know that I gave it a whole lot of thought at the time, but certainly once I started teaching, I began to realize, and I think this goes along with kind of the implicit knowledge of grammar, that there were things that I could teach, there were things that I knew well, and there were things that I think implicitly I felt like there needed to be a structure to what I was doing. I didn't quite know what that was. I didn't know the order that I should be teaching things, and no one provided that. Teaching English in Japan was very much the blind leading the blind, and none of us knew that we were blind. And so I think that was probably one of the more important realizations, to be teaching in Japan, to be teaching English, to have this degree in English, and then eventually come to realize that I did not have the same understanding, or have an understanding of grammar that would allow me to teach it the way I kind of implicitly knew that I wanted to teach it. So when I discovered your essay, it kind of felt, I use this metaphor a lot, it felt like Neo coming out of the Matrix. I was very upset. And then I didn't want to believe it. Like there was like denial, like I was reading it and I was like, did I not get this education, and then I was furious, and then I read it again, and then I pushed it away, and then I went and got it back. But it was a revelation to realize that there were hierarchical principles, not just in mathematics and perhaps science, I guess. I mean, they exist in all subjects, but I think you really only become aware of that in mathematics. Certainly, I wasn't aware that that was a thing in grammar, and so to kind of come to that realization was enlightening. And I think, I don't know if I got this from the YouTube videos or not, but I definitely eventually got my hands on RexBarks. I don't remember if it was from the video. I know I got it from you. And I feel like maybe it was in that article or maybe it was on a YouTube video, I'm not sure. But once I read the book, again, it is a very good resource for reading. It's a very good resource for self-learning. But what I eventually found it was a very good resource for putting the principles of grammar in order. And the notion that you could have much simpler principles and then much more complex principles in grammar was not something that had occurred to me until then. And once it did, it not only very quickly organized all of the principles that were kind of running around haphazardly in my mind, but it also made it much easier to teach grammar, teach English to Japanese students at the time, which is what I was doing. And then eventually I developed a system for teaching it there that I thought I could apply to teaching grammar to anyone, and then that brought me here. So I guess just very quickly, I'd like to just kind of demonstrate very quickly what I think the hierarchy is, and that's for the most part what the structure of my teaching instruction is. So I divide the school year up into 3 parts. I consider what are called the principal parts to be the most basic parts of grammar, relatively speaking. They are the parts of a sentence that you must have in order to make a sentence, and they are the noun, the verb, and the pronoun. Incidentally, when I began to research grammar and the history of grammar, I discovered that Aristotle and many Greek philosophers or Greek thinkers on this subject determined those to be, those were the first parts of speech that they discovered as well, and then they eventually began to name other parts. So I generally like to make sure that my students know that first. At the very youngest ages, they need to be able to point out a noun and a pronoun and a verb. Then we move on to the adjunct parts, which are adjectives and adverbs, and eventually prepositions, prepositional phrases, and interjections. They're more of a peripheral part. That would be my third part. And so there are lots of parts of grammar that are more peripheral, and whether or not they're necessary or not, is kind of up to debate. So I guess one really quick demonstration of how important it is to have hierarchy in the teaching of grammar is in the teaching of the parts of speech and how complex they can be. So, or how simple they can be, but how complex they can be. So when I teach nouns and verbs very simply to much younger children, I like to make sure that they know what a simple noun is, or are able to identify just nouns simply. And so that might come across in a sentence like, the boy runs. And this would be a very simple sentence, and we have just a noun, and we have a verb. If you were going to diagram that, you would have boy, and you would have runs here, and like this. Once they can identify these simple parts in sentences, they will move on to adjectives. The is an example of an adjective, but a simple sentence with adjectives might look like this. So we have the boy runs quickly, where we have our noun and our verb, and then we have simple adjectives and a simple adverb. What was really interesting to me is once you can grasp what an adjective and an adverb is, it makes learning what a prepositional phrase is much more simply. And again, if I were to diagram this, we would end up with a very simple diagram that looks like this. All right, so we have our noun and our verb, very simple adjective, very simple adjectives, and a very simple adverb. Once I read Rex Barks and recognized that a prepositional phrase is just a slightly more complex version of an adjective and an adverb, that made it much more easy, or made it much easier for me to explain that to students. So we could say the boy with the hat runs, for lack of a better prepositional phrase right now, with great speed. And so we have here a prepositional phrase, two prepositional phrases, one that describes the boy, one that describes the verb. And again, so these are just slightly more complex versions of what this adjective and this adverb are here. And if you were to diagram that, you would have boy runs, and with great speed here, with the hat goes here. And with great speed would go here. And so as the students, once the students are able to grasp just what an adjective or an adverb is, I now have a better context from which to tell them what a prepositional phrase is and what it's doing. And so this would be considered an adjective phrase. This would be considered an adverb phrase. But that becomes clearer to them once they know what an adjective and what an adverb is. And then finally, once they know that, by the time they get to about 7th or 8th grade. So usually adjectives, I don't teach the younger grades now, but I would make sure they could get that in 2nd grade. Usually they could also get prepositional phrases in the 2nd grade as well. And then as they progress through their career here at VanDamme, I like to show them much more complex versions of adjectives and adverbs. I think, I can get into that a little bit more later. But once they know adjectives, I move to prepositional phrases, which are adjective phrases and adverb phrases. And then finally, we can come to adjective clauses and adverb clauses, which are dependent clauses. And I can teach them that within the context of knowing what simpler phrases are or what just simple adjectives and adverbs are. So an example would be the boy who cried wolf ran because no one believed him. And now what we have here is a much more complex version of an adjective. Who cried wolf is an adjective phrase that describes the boy. And because no one believed him, I'm sorry, did I say that correctly? Who cried wolf is an adverb clause. Did I say clause?
Adjective clause.
Adjective clause. Goodness. Yeah, I guess I
No,
did.
he knows. He just
I
said
guess
the
I
wrong
just
word.
sorry. The boy who cried. So who cried wolf is an adjective clause that describes boy, and because no one believed him would be an adverb clause that describes how he ran. And again, why he ran rather. And so as we move through, generally just further and further, or more and more complex versions of adjectives and adverbs, and more complex diagrams, they would move from a diagram that's very simple like this to a diagram that would be a little more, or much more complex, something like this.
So by demonstrating this, I don't know if you're seeing the phenomenon that I was describing before, that if he didn't have these lines and arrows on the sentence, it would just be a series of words. The boy who cried wolf ran because no one believed him. And they would exist on a level plane with no differentiation or no evident relationships between them. And I've tutored kids in Rec Sparks before who begin seeing the sentence just that way. I mean, they're not able to differentiate the parts at all. And then it goes from that to the feeling that we now have looking at this sentence, which is immediately you begin to see it in units. You see who cried wolf as a clause. You see because no one believed him as a clause. Your mind picks out the subject and the verb. And you see it in terms of the relationships among them, you know, demonstrated by those arrows or demonstrated by this diagram. So the process of going through how to diagram and going through that process with individual sentences again and again eventually gives you the ability to just see at a glance what all those parts are and how they all relate to each other. And that's empowering for all the reasons I said before.
All right, and so ultimately, you know, having studied Rex Sparks, and really in general, once I went from that book, once I studied that book, I went into many other books, and ultimately, once I learned the parts of speech and learned how to diagram, it became clear to me that no matter how complex the grammatical structure was, it all fit in some way into those 8 parts of speech. And I think that was also a very enlightening thing for me to know that there are hundreds of thousands of English words and various ways in which we can construct them and use them. But they all, no matter how complex the phrase is or the clause is, and no matter what the word is, they all fit within those 8 parts of speech. And they are just they're just different levels of complexity. And ultimately, that, you know, if I can teach that to the students, I feel that they can hold that in their heads better. They can better organize all of the complexities of grammar, or seeming complexities of grammar. So.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It's an interesting point to make because, you know, if you were exposed to grammar at all, you learned phrases and clauses, and you learned adjectives and adverbs, and you learned prepositional phrases. But to see that those prepositional phrases are adjectives and adverbs, all prepositional phrases are adjectives or adverbs, to see that those clauses are nouns, adjectives, or adverbs, all of them fall, you know, together as a unit. That's what they are, and that part of it is that's what makes them a clause. That's or a phrase. It's a unit. And that it's a unit because it's serving that particular purpose within the sentence. So,
and it really shrinks up the sentence for you, because a sentence like this can be very long. I think, but by the 8th grade, I have the students looking at the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence, which is a very long sentence. It's a paragraph-long sentence.
And it's hard to even find the subject.
Finding the and I usually like to find the students who are particularly confident. Tell them to find the subject. That subject comes 20 words in or something like that. The subject is nowhere near the beginning. And so that's, like, it's nowhere near the beginning of that sentence. And I guess the last part of this is just, so we've just talked about clauses and phrases here, but we've just talked about adjective clauses and adjective and adverb clauses. We've just talked about those, but participle phrases work the same way. And teaching students what a participle is fits into teaching them what an adjective is. It's just a different kind of phrase that modifies nouns. And you know, once you say that, the term dangling participle is going to be, or dangling modifier, is going to be something they hear going through high school, going through college. But if they know that it's just, specifically if they know that it's a kind of adverb, they know it should be modifying a noun. It should be talking about a noun.
You keep saying the wrong.
What am I saying?
You just keep saying the reversing adjective and adverb. Adjective. You said adverb.
My goodness.
Your brain is just getting ahead of your mind.
Yeah, I guess so. Let me say that again. Talking about participle phrases, right? If they know that it's an adjective, they know that it modifies a noun. And yeah, so even in that regard, they'll know that if their adjective phrase or this participle phrase is out of place, they'll be looking for the noun that it needs to be attached to. So, you know, all of the various complex structures that just, especially insofar as they have these really weird names or names that don't seem to apply to anything but just grammar, if they can relate it to those simple 8 parts of speech. If they know it's just a kind of adjective, it's just a kind of adverb, it's just a kind of noun, or it's a more complex verb phrase or something like that, it just makes it more intelligible for them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Yes.
What are the 8 parts of speech? Like,
Yes.
I came up with 5.
You came up with 5. What do you have?
Okay, so I'm taking notes on my phone. I have nouns, verbs, adjectives, adverbs,
Those are-
pronouns, prepositions.
Conjunction, interjection.
Okay, I used to learn article. What's an article? now?
Article's
Type
an
of adjective.
Okay,
Yeah.
so what were the last 2?
Conjunction, interjection.
Interjection, I've never heard of. That's interesting.
Wow. That's an introduction.
Yeah, okay. That's an example.
But so he mentioned casually that, well, those are peripheral, and those don't fall at the heart of a sentence. Well, when you're diagramming interjections, they float on lines above the sentence.
Yeah.
They have no grammatical connection
Right.
to the rest of the sentence. So again, with diagramming, you see visually at a glance that this is something that is grammatically separate from the rest of the sentence. We still need a term for them because now we have the ability to talk about them, but they are separate in that way, and that's another benefit of learning to diagram, is just being able to see that at a glance. Miss Verkest.
Okay.
I just want to say
Oh,
that
yeah.
was absolutely amazing to me. As someone who has the total implicit view of grammar,
Yeah,
that was completely eye-opening what you just did.
right.
I hope so.
Adjective,
I didn't confuse you too much
prepositional
with
phrase,
the
adverb.
adverb.
No.
I feel like I got a whole course in grammar, and
Yeah.
so much has become clear to me, just
Right.
from how simple, and then building and building. It's like,
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah,
That's how I felt when I read the book.
it's a
Yeah.
system.
It-
It all relates. Okay.
Okay, so I'm pre-Rex Sparks. And I had a similar upbringing to Lisa's. I did not have any formalized grammar. And when I first started teaching 20-some years ago, I thought, why should there be a formalized grammar instructional program in the elementary grades? Then I started teaching writing and delving into writing, and I realized how important knowing grammar terms, how to use the proper parts of speech were, and found the Easy Grammar 20-some years ago, which takes a different course of action because it begins with prepositions. And I found that it makes sense for me because if the students can identify prepositions and prepositional phrases within a sentence, they can more easily find the subject and other functions of nouns, like the direct object. And then I saw, wow, I can use prepositional phrases to teach the students how to expand their sentences. So I carried the grammar over into the writing. So the boy cried. This is a simple sentence. Here's your noun, here's your verb. So I know that they come in knowing what nouns and verbs are, and a simple sentence has a noun and verb. But how do we expand that sentence? We need more information, guys. The boy cried below or under the tree. So there's your prepositional phrase. And then I like to introduce sentence starters so that we can vary our sentences, and prepositions are a way to vary sentences if you know how to begin a sentence with a prepositional phrase. So prepositions just work into my writing program as a very functional part, and that's why I like to introduce them first, and that's what the Easy Grammar program starts with, which, kind of goes against, well, why don't we start with nouns and verbs and other parts of speech? But I could see the function and the reason why you identify the prepositional phrases, because there are so many nouns in long sentences that if you recognize the prepositional phrase, the subject can never be in the prepositional phrase. So you just say, okay, there's a noun, it's not the subject. Where's another noun?
Can I add one quick thing to that? So when they learn the prepositional phrases at the start of Easy Grammar, they're not really learning them conceptually so much as just being able to identify and
Right.
recognize them. So it's largely memorized at first, which sounds like it's against our principles. Well, we're just teaching them empty memorization of prepositions. Yes, we are, to allow them to clear them out of the sentences and focus on the basic building blocks of the sentence. So they memorize the prepositions. They can quickly see, oh, we don't have any there anymore, but they can quickly see those as a unit and clear them out of the sentence. And one thing that lets you do, Rex Barks is called Rex Barks because it's a subject and a verb, right? It's just the simplest sentence possible. But if you want to introduce identifying subjects and verbs to young children, you have to come up with the most awkward and artificial of sentences if you're only going to have them contain a noun and a verb. I mean, even "the boy cried" has an adjective in it. So that approach lets you give them more natural sentences that they would really encounter in everyday life and clear out the prepositional phrases and then focus on those basic building blocks.
And then it moves straight into verbs. So it doesn't get into nouns, the basic nouns, until later. But again, verbs, knowing their verbs and their verb phrases helps in their writing. So the easy grammar really helps me in their writing because I can teach verb tenses, which they don't really have a knowledge of coming into early elementary. So once they know their verb tenses, I could say, okay, this essay or this story is going to be written in past tense. And they will all automatically know, okay, all my verbs have to be in past tense. So instead of the knowledge of diagramming, I'm teaching them how to use their parts of speech, sometimes in a different order than the diagramming, but it suits their writing. So if I say, okay, and they tend to jump from present tense to past tense. And once they know they're doing this, they can change, oh, I see, yeah, and they can go back and change the verb tenses.
And there's nothing necessarily in diagramming that tells you whether a verb is present tense or past
Right,
tense.
that's a separate,
So
yeah.
they have to know that going
Yeah.
into
Right.
Rex Sparks. And the irregular verbs are a whole different ballgame because walked is a regular verb, but run and ran are not. So they have to know how to use their irregular verbs properly. I see the boat. All right, that's present tense. Okay, I saw the boat. That's past tense. I have seen the boat. So they have to know how to properly use their irregular verbs. So easy grammar just helps with the writing curriculum, even though it's in a different order than Rex Sparks. And then we jump into nouns. They have to know how to use a possessive noun, so many different types of nouns. Possessive, how to make plural nouns, how to make proper nouns. So then we delve deeper into nouns. I do skip. I teach them basically, okay, an adjective and an adverb modify. Well, an adjective modifies a noun, an adverb modifies a verb, but we do use these in writing as our dress-ups. So once they have the basic understanding, okay, look for a noun and add some adjectives, look for a verb and add some adverbs. I jump into pronouns and then go back and delve deeper into the adjectives and adverbs because there's so much to know there. But pronouns are commonly misused, like Miss VanDamme was giving examples of, in their writing. My sister and me went to the store. I went to the store with my sister. That's wrong. I had some examples. Me and my sister play tennis. That's wrong. My sister and I play tennis. But if I said he plays tennis with my sister and I, that's incorrect. So they have to understand the difference between a subject pronoun and an object pronoun, because this is a common mistake in their writing, and I want to correct that early on.
And then what people do to try to compensate is just always use I, because
Right.
It's like that must, that's
as
the
they
right.
said, there's an absolutely classic grammar debate in an episode of The Office, and my favorite line from it is, I is the formal version of the, it's who and whom they're talking about, and he
whom
says,
is the-
whom is the formal version of the word. has a proper place.
So, and then I go back to adjectives and adverbs and teach the different functions of the adjectives and adverbs. But I find that easy grammar helps. I don't know if your students have ever talked about their dress-ups that they add to their paragraphs, their essays, but all the dress-ups are a form of a grammatical term. And we start with quality adjectives, ly adverbs, who, which clauses, so I don't delve into what kind of, I mean, this is just a clause added into a sentence, but later on they learn the function of that clause. Because clauses, prepositional phrases, so that is, and I realized that grammar is a necessary function of writing. We also do, instead of diagramming, we do color coding. So at the beginning of the year, they decide what color the different parts of speech will be, and then we come up with different sentences periodically throughout the year, especially when we learn the different types of adjectives and adverbs, because there are so many different types. And they color code their sentences, which is my basic, not diagramming, but
No, I love this. I love this
identifying.
because, so what's really
parts of
interesting with,
speech.
I think they do something similar in the kindergarten as
In
well, right?
Montessori, yeah, there's part of
And
the Montessori.
when I was in Japan, I came up with what I hope and what I think kind of worked well as a simple kind of diagram. I call it a grammar train. I don't know how many of you know what that is. If you have kids who've been here in third grade, they probably know, or second grade, they probably know the grammar train. Well, when I was teaching second and third grade, and it's color coded, and I find that the colors do help them remember what certain parts of speech are and how to use it. So
They like their colored pencils
Uh-huh.
in second and third grade.
Absolutely.
So.
And ninth, I found.
And what's that?
And ninth, she still uses
Oh,
it.
yeah.
It's like, yeah, no.
Oh, they
Forever.
always love it.
I
That's
use-
eternal. So, should we open the floor to questions? What questions do you have? Yes.
So how does punctuation fit into your teaching of grammar?
Oh, I meant to get
Yeah.
I mean,
Sorry.
it's going to fit in the same way in a writing sense. So
I-
I don't know if you'll take into
I
it.
skipped that part, but I do incorporate the punctuation and grammar, the punctuation and capitalization, especially when I see the need, for instance, when they're doing titles and they don't know what to capitalize in titles, I'll focus on that. When they are making a complex or compound sentence and they don't know where the commas go, I'll get into that. When they're overusing their apostrophes, thinking this should be a possessive noun and it's not, I'll get into that.
So, it is, there are punctuation rules in Easy Grammar. There are punctuation rules covered in the Warner's textbooks, which you still use. Punctuation is covered in every assignment they ever do. The most common mistake my 7th and 8th graders make, even now, is punctuation of possessives. And every time I hand back an assignment, they correct all their spelling and they correct all their possessives mistakes. So it's something that's reinforced in all their writing classes and introduced in their grammar
Yeah, it is
classes.
important to, I guess we build this as the grammar talk, but grammar and writing are very much integrated. They have to be integrated. There's no way to really teach grammar without teaching writing. I should probably also point out that, I'm sorry, yeah.
And vice versa, and, yeah.
Yeah, and vice versa. So I teach Rex bars in 8th grade. I don't use that in the 2nd grade or 7th grade. I use that in the 8th grade. And I like it, again, mostly as a tool to kind of wrap up everything that they've been learning through the years and give them that conceptual, hierarchical, make sure they have an explicit, to make sure they're explicitly aware of that hierarchical connection between the different grammatical principles. There is no punctuation in diagramming. Students love to try to put it there too. And I'm just like, where would you put it? There's no cap. There's not necessarily any cap.
They need 3D diagrams.
Yeah, I don't know what they would use for
I
that.
just have kind of a funny story.
Yeah.
I had my 3rd graders in preparation for this. I asked the experts, how are grammar and writing related and why are they important? And one of my students, and then we started going over topic sentences. So one of my students said, grammar and writing are like two peas in a pod. And then another one said, grammar and writing are like elves and Santa. And then grammar and writing are like salt and pepper. It's like they all came up with their own analogies why grammar and writing are so interrelated and important to each other. So
That's cute.
they were.
I will only finally say that as they're learning to become, as they're learning to conceptualize the different units of grammar, it does make teaching punctuation much easier, particularly commas, because you're talking about complex sentences. You're talking about, I mean, you use them to separate different units and not other units that look very similar if you don't know how to tell the difference between the two units. So the short answer is that it's very integrated with writing. And yes.
Am I allowed to ask a writing question then, or no?
Sure.
Is there a way you could just walk through, like, so kindergarten, first grade, they start with one paragraph essay or whatever, and then just all the way through eighth, just the building blocks?
I'm actually going to forestall that question. We will do a presentation on writing, and actually, if you go to YouTube, to the VanDamme Academy YouTube page, I think there's a several-part series on our writing curriculum where we lay out that whole sequence. So that does exist in much more elaborate detail than we'll be able to give you right now, and we will be sure to have a presentation on writing too. Yeah.
What grades do you both teach? I just wasn't sure.
I teach writing to second, third, and fourth,
Okay.
and grammar to third. I've taught the grammar curriculum to all the elementary through the years, but since I took on math, and Mr. Emmy now has taken on more of the grammar.
I teach 5th through 8th. At one point, I taught 2nd through 8th, and then I was able to move on to just 5th through 8th.
And so Mr. Emmy is teaching 2nd and 4th right now. Yeah.
Grammar.
Grammar.
Yes.
So how do you teach, like for today, I just learned that an article is an adjective. So I never knew that. So I'm seeing a lot of layers of complexity, but I'm also seeing individual words that on their own have a name. So, for example, how would you teach that? That an article is an article, but it also has a function.
I
as
do
an
it through a
adjective.
dance.
Because
third
I need
grade,
to know what it
so if you
is.
have a third grader, they should know the dance. So I call them noun determiners. They're also called limiting adjectives. So they're broken up into 5 groups. So we have a little dance for A in the R articles, which are adjectives. Or this, that, those, these are demonstratives, which are adjectives. So I teach whether they remember. I try to do a movement with it, so they try to remember it. But
There's a funny give and take with diagramming and this conceptualization of terms that happens outside of the actual diagram. So if you're diagramming a sentence and it is a blue bird sits in a tree, then you're going to learn that A is an adjective modifying bird, and you're going to learn to place it on the diagram in a way that indicates that it's modifying bird, but you also have to learn that that particular adjective is called an article and what the category of articles is. And I found in teaching grammar that I had to be careful when teaching diagramming to make sure that they're both learning to understand those relationships and retaining the means of explaining those relationships in words. So we would sometimes, I'd put a diagram on the board and I'd say, maybe take this diagram and turn it into a sentence and explain to me what all the parts of it are. So you can't teach grammar with only diagramming, But I do think that diagramming is an essential part of teaching grammar for seeing and understanding and grasping those relationships. But you have to do both.
So is there a time that maybe they are diagramming, but they don't have the language yet, or they already have the language to describe everything already?
So
A little bit of both. A little bit of both, I would say. Yeah.
there's definitely a time when they know all of the words and don't know the terms for them yet. I mean, they all are native English speakers, so they speak English. They use clauses before they really know what they are. I think ultimately, I generally introduce the principle or the concept before I teach the diagramming of it, and I think it's also important to. I just lost my train of thought. But the bigger thing here is that. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. The bigger thing is that they learn what an adjective is and know that there are lots of things that fit into the term adjective, and then that can be broken down. We don't teach. I certainly don't teach all of this at the same time, but it's particularly why I think it's important to teach in sections and to teach over the course of a year. Over the course of several years, so that perhaps in the beginning they'll learn that adjectives are just going to describe nouns. When I taught second grade, I would just teach them that there were words that would describe nouns. I wouldn't teach them that there were pronouns that describe nouns, because that's what half of these adjectives are. So the limiting adjectives are articles a, and the, which are the only articles, but then they're demonstrative pronouns, this, that, these, and those. I don't tell them that because they're still trying to get their head around the term pronoun, and I don't want to throw them off by letting them know, oh yeah, pronouns are adjectives like half the time. Possessive pronouns are also adjectives, and so that's something I wouldn't want them to really try to get their head around until about 6th grade. And so the fact that by breaking the school year up into three terms, so that first they're only dealing with nouns, pronouns, and verbs, and then after Christmas they'll deal with adjectives and adverbs and various types of adjectives and adverbs, and then after spring break I like to teach them what I call the peripherals, which usually will focus on interjections and punctuation to some degree and various other parts. But by doing that and then knowing that they're going to be learning this from 2nd to 8th grade while they're here allows me to not try to fill their heads with all of this at the same time. When they learn pronouns at the beginning of the year, they, say for example in the 6th grade, they might learn that there are demonstrative pronouns and possessive pronouns. I'll let them learn at the beginning of the year so that after Christmas I can say, remember those demonstrative pronouns and possessive pronouns? Well, a good half of them can also be adjectives, but I'll teach them that while I'm teaching them adjectives. And so that kind of lets them help. So knowing the hierarchy helps, but also knowing that I have a period of time over which to teach them this information, and knowing as well that I'm going to spend, it seems, I don't know if it seems counterintuitive to say, okay, for the next, 4 months, how long is a term generally? 4 months, I'm only going to talk about nouns. That may seem like, oh, we're not covering enough, but there's so much to learn about nouns and pronouns that just knowing that that's the structure of the school year and the school curriculum, so to speak, the whole, timeline of their career here lets me take my time and organize that information and build it so that it's intelligible. So.
Yes.
I had a question. That Mr. Emmy surprised me by saying that there are undecided, within diagramming, there are things that have not been fully formalized or decided.
So,
This was a shock to me.
so this will come up in discussion among us and sometimes with the students, that we'll come to something that we're trying to diagram and it won't fit neatly into any of the principles of diagramming. And we know the principles of diagramming. If it fits, we're going to be able to fit it. And whenever that comes up, I like to point out to the students, which comes first, language or the rules of diagramming? It's not like there were stone tablets with rules of diagramming, and then language was derived from those. We developed a means of communicating, and a lot of the nature of that communication has an inescapable basis in reality. We're always talking about things doing things. So every sentence has a noun and a verb, because that's what it means to communicate, is to say what something is or is doing. So there are certain kind of fundamental just ways in which they reflect reality that creates fundamental rules, and then it gets more complex and more subtle the more complicated language gets. But so these principles are inductive generalizations about those things in reality that are inescapable, and we need a means of describing them. So they're conceptualizations or generalizations about, okay, we have this category of words that describe things. We need a way to explain that and have rules about it. And then there are principles of grammar that are more in the realm of optionality, that are conventions over time that aren't necessarily inextricably bound to reality, but just we need a means that we agree upon for making sure that communication is clear. But then there are things that just we haven't come up with a way to explain or address that, or it's sort of a borderline case, or it doesn't squarely fit. But that's true for anything where you're generalizing principles to describe a system. There are always going to be things that are outliers or borderline cases, or don't squarely fit into that set of generalized rules. So the reason I like to answer that to them is just to show them that relationship, that these are ways we've come up with describing in general terms the nature and relationships among language, but there's always going to be, in any system like that, there are always going to be things that don't quite neatly fit in.
Do you guys go to grammar conferences and have hot debates about it?
No,
There
just
are
in
hot
the
debates
office.
in linguistics.
Oh
courses
yeah,
somewhere. Yeah.
that's for sure.
Yeah, there's a whole debate over what is it, descriptive grammatical rules versus should grammar be descriptive
Or prescriptive,
Or prescriptive
right,
is that
yeah.
one? Yeah. Should it dictate the rules or just describe the rules? And yeah, I mean she answered that mostly.
A former teacher at this school, Mrs. O'Brien, she and her husband went across the country interviewing people about grammar and the role of grammar, and they even got to Noam Chomsky and Steven Pinker. So they have a documentary they produce called Grammar Revolution, and she has a company called Grammar Revolution where she sells grammar curriculum. She started here at VanDamme Academy. Any other questions? All right, well, thank you so much for coming, and I'll let you know what the next topic will be.